California weighs economic alliance with Canada as federal debt hits record highs. Washington state explores Cascadia trade zone amid tech tariff fallout. America's wealthiest states are no longer whispering. They're openly asking, what if we bypass Washington, D.C. altogether? As the national debt soars past $36.6 trillion and federal policies cripple local industries, places like California, Washington, and even Maine are floating radical ideas. Bilateral pacts with Canada, direct trade lanes, economic secession in everything but name. In a country tearing itself apart financially, the richest corners are looking north, not to leave America behind, but to save themselves from it. But when your own union feels broken, how far would you go to find a better deal across the border? There was a time when the idea of a fractured United States seemed unthinkable. Red states, blue states, sure, they argued. But the fundamentals held: a shared economy, federal redistribution, and a belief that every state, rich or poor, played a role in a common project. States like California, Washington, Vermont, and Maine contributed generously to federal taxes, often far more than they received. In return, they accepted the role of balancing the national ledger, underwriting states with weaker economies, outdated industries, or deeper needs. For decades, it worked, imperfectly but predictably. But something's changed. As of July 2025, the U.S. national debt has surpassed $36.6 trillion, more than 116% of GDP. Annual interest payments now top $1 trillion, crowding out spending on everything from infrastructure to healthcare. In the name of fiscal responsibility, federal programs are being slashed, but not equitably. Coastal states, especially those with strong economies and progressive tax structures, are being asked to carry a heavier load while receiving less support. California, with a GDP over $4.1 trillion, contributes tens of billions more to Washington than it gets back. Vermont and Maine run budget surpluses, yet have little say over how federal dollars are spent or which tariffs are imposed on their core industries. Washington state's tech and manufacturing sectors have been hammered by Trump's tariffs on Korean and Japanese components, despite contributing massively to national innovation. That resentment is morphing into something more than anger. It's turning into policy proposals, ideas once relegated to the fringes: Cascadia trade zones, bilateral agreements with Canada, or even semi-autonomous economic blocs, are now being discussed in boardrooms and state houses, not because these states want to leave the U.S., but because they're not sure the U.S., as it stands, is still working for them. Washington's war on itself. In early 2025, facing mounting pressure from conservative lawmakers and bond markets, the Trump administration launched a sweeping set of emergency economic measures. The goal: rein in spending, reassure creditors, and reinforce America First economic sovereignty. The results were politically explosive, especially for the states footing the bill. First came the blunt cuts: a federal hiring freeze, delayed infrastructure disbursements, and the rollback of tax credits for renewable energy, housing, and technology. Programs disproportionately used by blue states, like electric vehicle subsidies and clean tech investment grants, were either gutted or restructured to benefit oil and coal-producing regions. Then came the tariffs. In March 2025, the administration imposed steep import duties on a range of goods from South Korea and Japan, citing national security risks and trade imbalances. The decision blindsided semiconductor and electronics manufacturers in Washington, California, and Oregon. Samsung and LG scaled back U.S. operations, while downstream companies, from smartphone assemblers to battery suppliers, watched their margins collapse. We are essentially being taxed to support federal debt that we didn't create, wrote one California tech CEO in an open letter. Meanwhile, our supply chains are being crippled by decisions we have no power to prevent. By July, the federal government signed a revised trade deal with Seoul. South Korea agreed to invest $350 billion in the US, including $100 billion for LNG purchases, in exchange for a reduced 15% tariff. But for American coastal states, especially those dependent on Korean imports, the damage was already done. Meanwhile, the national debt kept climbing. With $1 trillion in annual interest payments, Congress was forced to look for new revenue. That meant squeezing wealthier states. Federal tax reforms in Q2 2025 capped deductions on state income and property taxes, effectively penalizing high-tax, high-income regions like California, New York, and Massachusetts. Simultaneously, federal disaster relief and education grants were restructured on a per capita basis, not need or risk, leaving wildfire-prone western states and hurricane-exposed northeastern communities dangerously underfunded. The message was clear: contribute more, receive less, and stay silent. But the backlash didn't stay silent for long. In Sacramento and Olympia, lawmakers began to openly discuss fiscal divergence. Think tanks proposed legally defensible frameworks for semi-autonomous budgeting, modeled on Quebec's dual account system. In Vermont and Maine, discussions centered on binational regulatory harmonization with Canadian provinces for environmental protection, fisheries, and transportation. And the most radical idea began to surface: why not formalize economic alignment with Canada? Canada's quiet embrace. While Washington was struggling to hold its union together, Ottawa watched with quiet interest and cautious readiness. Canada had long maintained soft power ties with its southern neighbors. Bilateral trade with U.S. states like Michigan and New York was already deeply integrated. But what emerged in mid-2025 was something different, not just trade. Political and economic alignment, state by state. British Columbia, long an advocate of Cascadia regionalism, held discreet meetings with officials from Washington and Oregon. The conversations focused on shared environmental policies, joint infrastructure financing, and even interlinked climate legislation. Topics once considered fringe: cross-border carbon pricing, dual citizenship work permits, reciprocal healthcare, were floated with surprising seriousness. In Eastern Canada, Quebec's Ministry of Intergovernmental Affairs initiated dialogue with Vermont and Maine. Fishing rights, lumber trade, and cross-border labor mobility dominated the agenda. The lobster crisis, triggered by Trump's tariffs on Canadian processing, had devastated Maine's seafood industry. Canadian firms offered to bypass federal restrictions entirely by investing directly in Maine facilities under joint corporate charters. Ottawa didn't push these conversations, but it didn't stop them either. In fact, federal ministers quietly supported what they called multi-speed diplomacy. They viewed regional cooperation as a stabilizing force in a destabilized U.S. economy. Privately, Canadian officials admitted they were preparing for scenarios in which state-level compacts could supersede federal U.S. trade policy. Canadian think tanks published white papers on subnational diplomacy, strategies for provinces to engage directly with U.S. states on climate, energy, and tech. The model, they argued, already existed. European regions like Catalonia and Scotland had inked international agreements without full sovereignty. The tone in Canadian media shifted too. Columnists in the Globe and Mail and La Presse debated whether expanding economic ties with wealthy U.S. states could be a hedge against future instability in Washington. Some raised concerns about overreach, but others saw opportunity. If American unity falters, why shouldn't Canada offer a stable alternative? To be clear, Canada wasn't seeking annexation or formal union, but it was ready to accommodate, even accelerate, the growing divergence between U.S. states and their federal center. And to the surprise of many, public sentiment in Canada was cautiously supportive. Polls showed that 61% of Canadians viewed deeper cooperation with coastal U.S. states as beneficial, especially on technology, climate, and education. Even in conservative Alberta, a surprising 47% supported state-level agreements, provided they didn't compromise national interests. As America fractured from within, Canada's open arms began to look not just welcoming, but pragmatic. A continent on the brink. As summer 2025 progressed, North America found itself in uncharted waters. In Washington, D.C., federal officials dismissed talk of state Canada realignment as economic sedition. One senior advisor to President Trump labeled it traitorous fantasy. Yet behind closed doors, even some Republican governors admitted that their states could no longer operate under federal constraints that ignored economic reality. The federal government's insistence on unity was increasingly met with regional indifference. California's legislature passed a resolution demanding the right to negotiate parallel trade frameworks with foreign partners. Washington State's governor proposed a digital infrastructure treaty with British Columbia, bypassing federal IT security protocols. These moves didn't carry legal secession, but they sent a clear message: we're no longer asking permission. At the same time, legal scholars debated whether the U.S. Constitution allowed for subnational foreign compacts. Most agreed it didn't, but others pointed to loopholes used historically by port authorities and regional commissions. If fiscal federalism could be flexed during emergencies, why couldn't it also bend for economic self-preservation? Meanwhile, average Americans began to take notice. In Maine, small business owners dealing with lobster processing tariffs questioned why they had to pay the price for geopolitical posturing in D.C. In Seattle, tech workers watched their companies slash R&D budgets due to import costs and retaliatory levies. In Vermont, where budget discipline kept the state solvent, residents grew resentful of being asked to subsidize debt-fueled deficits in other parts of the country. On the Canadian side, the tone remained pragmatic but clear-eyed. Ottawa began quietly preparing for increased immigration from skilled American workers, particularly in tech, energy, and education. Provincial governments accelerated the development of visa-on-arrival pilot programs for U.S. professionals willing to relocate. Still, the deeper question remained unanswered. Would this shift in allegiance stop at economics or evolve into a broader realignment of identity and governance? Could North America function with two overlapping systems, one centralizing power in D.C., the other decentralizing it across a network of cross-border agreements? For now, both systems exist in uneasy parallel, neither dominant, both incomplete. And caught in between are millions of people, voters, taxpayers, workers, and business owners, watching the foundations of national identity flicker like an unstable signal. Some cling to the idea of the Union. Others quietly redraw maps in their minds. What's clear is that the center no longer holds unquestioned authority. What's unclear is what, if anything, will take its place. Impact on Canada. For Canada, deeper alignment with U.S. states brings prestige, but also profound risks. At first, it seemed like a diplomatic coup. The idea that California, Washington, or Vermont would want to cooperate directly with Canada on trade, tech, or climate was unthinkable just a few years ago. But as the dysfunction in Washington grew more visible, Ottawa's role as a quiet partner grew more attractive. British Columbia, for instance, saw a surge in tech collaboration. Joint projects with Seattle on cross-border green infrastructure and AI governance launched with unprecedented speed. University partnerships flourished. VC money flowed across the border, especially into Vancouver's clean tech sector. But with opportunity came growing friction. Canada's federal government began receiving quiet pushback from prairie provinces, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan, where energy-heavy industries feared being sidelined by the Cascadia bloc. These provinces worried that Canada's growing closeness with progressive coastal states in the U.S. could tilt national priorities too far toward climate restrictions, digital regulation, and ESG frameworks, threatening oil, gas, and mining interests back home. Meanwhile, the federal bureaucracy wasn't built for this kind of subnational diplomacy. Managing concurrent, non-federal relationships with multiple U.S. states introduced legal ambiguities, diplomatic headaches, and jurisdictional gray zones. Could Ontario sign a tech partnership with Massachusetts? Would Quebec's fisheries deal with Maine, override federal trade policy? And then came public pressure. Canadians began asking whether welcoming America's richest states came at the expense of national unity or sovereignty. "We're not a lifeboat for collapsing empires," read one editorial in the Toronto Star. Others warned of overdependence. What happens if the political winds in California change again? Most critically, Canada's role as a neutral, rules-based democracy is being tested. As one analyst noted, Canada may be gaining influence, but it's also absorbing America's chaos by proximity. Impact on the United States. For the U.S., the consequences of state-level divergence go beyond political theater. They strike at the heart of federal cohesion. In Washington, D.C., agencies are struggling to respond. The Departments of Commerce, State, and Homeland Security have been caught flat-footed by state-level agreements with foreign governments, even when those agreements are framed as economic memoranda or climate frameworks. There's no clear mechanism to block them, but also no precedent for managing their proliferation. This has created a governance vacuum. Federal policy is no longer uniform. Trade, immigration, and environmental enforcement are increasingly being shaped by state-to-province cooperation, not national legislation, and that disunity has a cost. In Maine, small seafood exporters who previously benefited from NAFTA now find themselves tangled in paperwork when trying to route products through joint Canada-US processing ventures. Without federal coordination, customs bottlenecks have slowed trade rather than streamlined it. In Washington state, the fragmented semiconductor supply chain has created uneven competitiveness. Some firms have access to Canadian partners and facilities. Others, bound to federal contracts, are stuck navigating tariff-heavy channels, making them less competitive globally. Even consumer confidence is being shaken. A recent Pew survey showed that 37% of Americans in coastal states now view federal institutions as ineffective or obstructive to their local economies. Meanwhile, 44% said they would support greater fiscal independence for their state if national debt and taxation trends continue. But perhaps most damaging of all is the erosion of shared identity. From school curricula to media markets, states are beginning to diverge not just economically, but culturally. California's public school system is developing joint climate science modules with British Columbia. Vermont's health regulators are studying Quebec's universal care model as an alternative to Medicare funding gaps. In short, the cracks aren't just budgetary, they're philosophical, and unless the U.S. finds a new way to balance national unity with local sovereignty, the fractures may become permanent fault lines. North America now stands at a precarious crossroads. Canada, once the junior partner in continental affairs, finds itself courted by the wealthiest corners of the United States, not as a savior, but as an escape route. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. clings to fiscal authority over a nation whose richest states are beginning to walk their own path. What began as policy disagreements has evolved into a structural reimagining of the American Union, not through secession, but through realignment. And for millions on both sides of the border, the future feels uncertain. Are we watching the rebirth of a new North American alliance, or the slow unraveling of the old? In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or fail apart by going it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.